The first thing I would suggest in terms of the consequences of sin, first thing I would suggest is that the wages of sin is death. Now we know that. We know that from Romans chapter 6, where we quote from Romans chapter 6, verse 23 all the time. The wages of sin is death. But I believe that God is making that point to us repeatedly here in these early chapters of Genesis. Of course, we know back in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 17, when God had placed man in the Garden of Eden, he told him that he could eat of any tree of the garden freely, but he said in verse 17, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you shall surely die. That was the warning from the very beginning. This is the first consequence of sin. This is the consequence that God spelled out even before man had sinned. You violate my commandment, you will die. And sure enough, when in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit, God confronts them. He says to the man, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 19, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. God says, you are going to die. Promised you death if you would violate my law. And so the wages of sin is death. But now, if you think about what happens in the subsequent chapters, it's amazing how those chapters are just permeated by death. Notice, for example, come over to, we know, of course, that Cain kills Abel. The very next thing the Bible tells us is Cain killing Abel. But come over to Genesis chapter 5, one of those genealogies that we find so easy to kind of skim through at times. There's a peculiar feature in that genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 that for a long time I didn't notice till somebody pointed it out to me. Notice, for example, in chapter 5 and verse 3, it says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. Then the days of Adam, after he became the father of Seth, were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Now you notice that last little note right there. And he died. Adam lived 930 years, and he died. Well, the next one, same way. Verse 6, Seth lived 105 years. Verse 7, he lived 807 years after he became the father of Enosh. Verse 8, so all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And then in verse 11, Enosh, in all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. And with, of course, the exception of Enoch, of whom we are told he walked with God and he was not, with that single exception, every one of these fellows ends by saying, and he died. Now, that's odd. I mean, maybe we've heard it so frequently we don't think about it being odd. But you don't normally say, my grandfather lived to be 85 years old, and then he died. I mean, we just understand. That's what happens. You live so many years and then you die. We don't have to say it. In fact, no other genealogy anywhere in the Bible takes the trouble to say at the end of everybody's life, and they died. Only this one, the first one. And I think there's probably a point to that. We tend to look at that, and what our eyes focus on are these long lifespans. We see 930 years. We see 912 years, etc. And our eyes kind of pop out, at those long periods of time that they live. But it seems to me what's really being emphasized is not that they live so long, but rather, despite the fact that they lived so long, they all died. Because the wages of sin is death. And of course, that point continues to be repeated throughout these chapters until, in fact, we come to the point where eventually all flesh is destroyed because of sin. And so, that's the first point, that the wages of sin is death. And it's just hammered home almost mercilessly in these opening chapters of Genesis.